Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. So today we are going to start the show a little bit different. We are going to start with a scenario from a friend of mine on Facebook, and we felt like this was really relatable and something that I'm sure everyone struggles with. So I'm going to go ahead and read her post verbatim, and then Dr. Burton and I were going to talk about it and give you some tips and advice. Okay, so she said, "This is going to sound like an odd question. Adolescent even. How do you deal with positive attention? It makes me physically uncomfortable and my entire brain says, nope. It really doesn't matter what kind of positive attention, compliments, flirting, job well done, any of it. Do you have this issue? How do you overcome it?" I mean, I feel like that's relatable. And I know particularly for women, it's kind of hard for us to accept compliments because we kind of tend to say, oh, thanks, but we give some reason for it,
Right. And I hear this often in my office, and it's not just females, it's certainly males have this also. And I think fundamentally, there are two reasons that I think this happens. And the first one is the main one. And I think it's about low self-esteem. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting is the person who wrote on Facebook said, my brain just goes nope, or something, says no way.
Yeah.
Well, our brain really hates inconsistencies. And so what that means is if I don't feel really good about myself, then it's really hard for me to hear anyone else saying anything positive about myself. And it's that inconsistency. We hate that. And so we just tend to turn it off, or the people who have this tend to turn it off, where it's almost like they're coated in Teflon, which I don't even know if Teflon is a thing anymore. But, when I was growing up, Teflon was the thing that you could cook eggs and they'd slide right off the pan. Well, everything slides right off them. Nothing is able to get in and have meaning. Now, often the context that I'll see this in is in relationships. So one of them, the other person is saying, well, you're wonderful. I love you. Great to be married to, and give all these positive compliments. And then the other person in the marriage, either lets it go, doesn't hear it, says no, some sort of negative response. So sadly, it is fairly common. So what the other one, which we can talk about a little bit before we go back to self-esteem, I think there are some probably religious traditions where pride is very much discouraged. And I've seen this occasionally, not often, but people who say, well, it's bad to be prideful. And so it was really something that was taught in their home growing up. And so if you think, you hear this as a child and through adolescence, your brain gets wired in that way that just says, nope, don't go down that road. I can't go down that road. So that doesn't happen very often, but I've certainly seen it. I think that, in that particular case, some good talk therapy, some good cognitive behavioral therapy, helping the person to change the way they're thinking about it is the way to go. But the low self-esteem is definitely a problem that many people deal with. And so I think, if we want to, we can talk about what do you do about that, that's a huge question. How do you change that?
Right. And because I think I've dealt with this in the past, or at least I know I would tend to, if someone said, hey, I like your hair. I said, oh, thanks. I just, I just threw it together real quick. And I try to,
you try to minimize it. Yeah.
Yeah. I try to minimize it. And so what I started doing is just saying, thank you. And that's it. Just say, fake it till you make it. So, just accept the compliment and move on with your day. So
the fake it till you make it is really, it works. And I'll talk more about that in a minute.
Yeah, it really does. And I've since then been able to not only better accept compliments, but give more genuine compliments to people. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
yeah, in my own personal experience. So there was one interesting comment on this Facebook post that said it's hard to accept kudos when you have been conditioned to only hearing the negatives for so long.
So that's the low self-esteem. So what I was going to say is that, well, let's just, one of the definitions of self-esteem is it's an internal barometer of how we think others see us. Now and so that is very much something that we learn growing up. And so it's a family of origin issue, typically. It certainly can happen later in adulthood, but most often it's a family of origin issue. And so if you have, sometimes there are parents who really focus on the negative. And I should make a comment before we talk any more about parenting. I think the vast majority of parents do the very best job they can. I think it's very rare that I've ever run into a parent who you think, okay, you just want to be mean and, not nice to your kid. Most parents, when they're behaving in such a way, when they're trying to parent their children, they're trying to do what they think is best for the child. But for some people, that means I'm going to tell you all the things you're doing wrong.
Yeah.
And the thought is, well, if I tell you all the things you're doing wrong, then you'll start to do something right and you'll get better. Yep. It's actually the opposite. And there are a few things that we know for certain in psychology. This is one of them, that if you focus on the positives, then you increase the likelihood that those positives will continue. Verbal reinforcement of positive verbal reinforcement of behaviors is one of the best things you can do to get a particular behavior to increase. And so focusing on the negative doesn't work really at all. And so if you grow up in a home where the parents don't do a very good job or an adequate job of instilling self-esteem, then I think that a strong self-esteem, then what happens is when you get older, it's very hard to take those compliments. So the question then would be, and I'm asked this often, okay, what do I do now? I'm 30 years old. I'm in a relationship, and this presents some problems occasionally in the relationships because my partner wants to tell me that, how much the partner loves me or likes me or whatever it is. And so it is problematic in relationships. So what do you do? So I have some ideas, and I'll give you a couple of them. The first one is a book, and I won't spend much time on it. It's called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, and the author's name is Nathaniel Branden. I heard Nathaniel Branden talk one time. This guy has very strong self-esteem. He thinks this is the greatest book ever written on self-esteem, which is great. But here's what I like about it. And I want to make this statement first. Very few people can actually follow his particular program. I'm pretty sure it's a 35-week program.
Okay.
He outlines it, how to do it. I'm not going to go into that right now, except to say that if you look at this program, it's about thinking of these thoughts about yourself and writing every single day for 35 weeks. But it's a very slow and subtle shifting of the way you think about yourself.
Okay.
So he's going about it more from, say, an internal perspective. I'm going to change the way I feel about myself. And I think it's a program that's really worth looking at, but you'd have to be pretty committed to spending 35 weeks. And it only takes, the most 10 minutes a day. So it's not like you're spending a lot of time. But to do anything for 35 weeks takes a pretty strong commitment. So I think if there are some listeners who are struggling with low self-esteem, I would certainly give that book a look and look at the program, which he outlines pretty specifically. Now, here's the way I approach it, though, with a lot of my clients, and it's what I call the behavioral roadmap. Now, in a lot of ways, it goes back to something you said earlier, Liz, in that you said, fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
So what I do is I try and explain that in some ways, there are two parts to the brain. Let's just call them the cognitive or the thinking part. And then on the other side would be the behavioral part. Mm-hmm. And so there is a two-way street between those two parts of the brain, meaning my behavior influences the way I think and feel, mm-hmm. and the way I think and feel influences the way I behave. And so if you think about which one of those is faster, like, do I change the way I think and feel, which then changes the behavior? That's actually a slower process. Mm-hmm. If, however, you decide I'm going to just change my behavior, which this is where the fake it till you make it comes in. Mm-hmm. And so this is the way I describe it. And we could try this with you if you'd be willing. I'm just going to do one thing. So, sure. So I talk about the ideal self. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think we all have an idea of what we want our ideal self to be. And the first step is to think of a quality or a characteristic in your ideal self. Now, it could be one that you have already or one that you might want to have. Do you have something? And we're talking a characteristic or quality.
I consider myself to be pretty empathetic with people.
Okay, great. So empathy is a wonderful quality. I mean, we could probably do a whole podcast on empathy and my thoughts on empathy. Yeah. So if you think about that kind of hierarchically, that's the top level. What's the behavior? So if you go down, what is a behavior of an empathic person?
I think someone who listens and genuinely cares about people.
So there you have it. That's perfect. Mm-hmm. And you could probably come up with 3 or 4 other behaviors. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what happens then is this takes a lot of time for the person to really sit down and think about, okay, who do I want to be?
Okay. Yeah.
And as I said a minute ago, it can be characteristics that you already have, or it can be characteristics that you want to have. Mm-hmm. But then the important part is you define the behaviors of that characteristic. And so I believe that it's the behavior. So going back to the two parts of the brain, that if you change your behavior and you act in a certain way, even though it may not feel genuine to you, eventually it will. And the behavior changing the way we think or feel is actually the faster way to change that. Now, so you might say, okay, what does this do for you? I think as far as self-esteem goes, and here's the connection. I think the closer you get to, let's call it your ideal self or the person you want to be, the closer you get to that, the higher your self-esteem. I think the further away you get from that, the lower your self-esteem. And so it's a way, if you think about what I said as far as my definition of self-esteem, that internal barometer on how we think others see us, the way to change that is through our behavior, because that's the way people see us. They see us, our behavior. And so let's just take yours with empathy, caring, and listening. And so if you then change that behavior and you become more caring and listening, people will think differently about you. They'll probably think more positively about you.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so in that way, over time, your self-esteem starts to raise. And then eventually what happens, I think, is you can get to that place where you can actually hear a compliment because it feels more genuine to you. There isn't that disconnect. That's not how I feel, so I can't hear you say that. That's what's going on. It's a disconnect for the person who wrote on Facebook.
Interesting. Yeah, and I love that, and I particularly love what you said about people will start to see and treat you differently, because I think how you project yourself and the way you come off has a lot to do with how people treat you. I mean, if you come off as a very friendly and open person and like you want to get to know someone, people are going to be receptive to that. But if you tend to be more shy and quiet, and it's not that you can't make friends that way, or you can't become friends with someone like that, but people are probably a little less prone to be receptive. It takes a little more to break open that shell.
Well, the problem with shyness is, I mean, the word I hear a lot of people misinterpret someone being shy as they think they're arrogant, is
No,
the way it
that's not at
comes
all.
across,
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
I
so,
can kind of see where people would think that, but I really think they're just not as comfortable as some
right,
people, speaking in social circumstances. I'm the type of person I can insert myself anywhere. In fact, I can email a random person I've never met and ask them if they want to do a podcast.
right, you
That's
can, and you did.
that's I did. That's the type of person I am. And not everyone is like that. And it's okay. I don't think that shyness is always arrogance. I think they just
Oh,
it's just a little bit.
I
Yeah.
don't think it ever
Yeah.
is. I'm just saying
Right. Yeah. It's
it's
perceived that way.
it's
Yeah.
misinterpreted
Yeah.
often.
Yeah.
I may hear that all the time, is the person
Mm-hmm.
is really shy
Mm-hmm.
and everyone else thinks, oh, they're so arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a third piece to this. There's a third thing that I think people can do. And this is a hard one. This is really
Mm-hmm.
tough
Okay.
because often as adults, we still are in contact with those people who treat us negatively or who talk to us negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially, every time you're around those people, which might be your parents, might be a sibling, might be friends, every time you are around them and they're negative about you,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think you lose ground because it's too hard to go back. You're pushed back into that, childhood or adolescent place where you're just being talked to negatively. So the hard thing to do is to set boundaries with
Mm-hmm.
people who are not
Yeah.
supportive or encouraging of you. Now, often that might be family members, and I realize that's hard. It's just if you have parents who aren't able to change that when you're an
Mm-hmm.
adult, it's very, very tough to ever feel good about yourself because it keeps getting replayed.
Mm-hmm. And setting boundaries, I agree that that's really important. So what is something that you think you could say, if maybe you have a parent who isn't supportive and they don't uplift you, how would that conversation go? What would you
So
say?
okay, so I've actually done this many times with clients, and
Uh-huh.
again, I'm going to say this, but I realize it's hard to do. I
Mm-hmm.
I don't want anyone to think, oh, this is going to be easy.
Right.
So here's what it is. Let's create the situation. You're an adult. You're married. You might have kids. You go over to your parents' house because you want to be there, and they want to see the
Mm-hmm.
grandkids. But one of your parents speaks negatively to you.
Mm-hmm.
I think you prepare and you say, Mom or Dad or Mom and Dad,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I when you talk to me this way, I don't feel good about myself and I'm going to try and change that. So we're going to leave right now, but we'll
Okay.
come back next week and hopefully you can try to behave differently. But if
Okay.
you do that again, we'll leave again.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, and you don't have to get mad, you don't have to get angry, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to say, I'm never going to see you again. You just
Right.
have to say, every time you treat me this way, I'm going to leave. Now, you can do the same thing on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Say you're talking to them. You say, Mom, Dad, do you remember I talked to you about, you speaking negatively to me? And so I'm going to hang up now, but I would like to talk to you again in a few days. And, we'll see if we can do this again and you can be kinder or more positive.
Mm-hmm.
So I would, in a very calm voice, and I'd write it down. I always suggest having a script. I think
Okay.
scripting things is really helpful. And it's not that you would take that script in, it's like you're rehearsing for a play almost. And
Mm-hmm.
here's my line, and I'm going to say this line. But I think that you have to follow one. If you say, I'm going to leave now, you have to follow through on that and you
Mm-hmm.
leave,
Mm-hmm.
even though it might be hard. But I also think it's important to say, we will come back and maybe even set a time when you might come back.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as parents and grandparents, at least this would be true for me. I don't know if it's true for others. I would want to see my children and my grandchildren. So
Right.
I would really work at changing my behavior.
Yeah. And
And, if that boundary were set, I'd change it.
right. And it puts it on them
Right.
to make the change. I really like that. So there's another comment that I thought was pretty interesting. We're going to switch gears here a little bit.
Okay.
And this person said, exposure and trust that there isn't an ulterior motive. It's an uncomfortable process, and it starts by not denying or reflecting a compliment someone gives you. And I think this comes back to the fake it till you make it part. That when someone's trying to give you a compliment, they probably just notice something about you, and maybe they admire it and they want to just genuinely give you a compliment. And, again, take that in and internalize it. And even if you just say, "Oh, thank you," and that's it. Don't try to mitigate it. Don't try to justify the compliment. Just say thank you.
No, I agree with that as a response. And I think if
Mm-hmm.
you can train yourself to just say, thank you, I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but going back, so this person who wrote the comment, does it seem or appear that they are afraid the compliment is a lead up to being taken advantage of? Is that it?
I read the comment verbatim, and
Okay.
my guess is that what this person has experienced in the past is, someone's, I don't know, like for example, if someone is flirting with you, they're really only giving you compliments because
Ah,
they want something from you. They want your number, or they want to, I don't know, maybe they want to hook up or something. And so I think that could be an issue that people maybe have dealt with in the past. And even if that is the case, you can still, I don't know, I think you'd be able to pick up on that pretty quick.
right. And I think context is really important. So if you have the
Yeah.
context of, you're in a marriage and your
Mm-hmm.
spouse gives you a compliment, then
Mm-hmm.
that's a very different context than if you're
Yeah.
out and someone is, flirting with you
Mm-hmm.
and you probably, I mean, that's probably a pretty good assumption that they want something from you. That's not a bad assumption. So I
Yeah.
think context is important. And,
Yeah.
trust is something that is earned.
Mm-hmm.
And so with a spouse, you've been together a long time, you've earned that trust, but you just met someone wherever you are. If you're in a bar or something,
Mm-hmm.
there's not going to be any trust there. There shouldn't be any trust there.
Yep.
And so, being a little bit wary of that compliment, that's not a bad thing
Yeah.
to be. So
Yeah.
I
I would
think
agree.
those are some ways that people who might have low self-esteem can start to work on it themselves. I think that doing some good talk therapy is
Mm-hmm.
also helpful because it helps someone put in perspective, I think, those family of origin
Yeah.
issues,
Mm-hmm.
which are often at play here. Or even, if it's that pride issue where you grew up
Mm-hmm.
in an environment where pride was discouraged, a huge amount of pride is not, I'm not going to say that's healthy.
Yeah.
I think you then drift over into that narcissistic world,
Yeah.
if you're too
Uh-huh.
prideful.
Yeah.
So being too prideful, I'd say, isn't great. But having some amount of pride in what you do and what you accomplish, I think that's a very healthy and natural thing to do, and to be able to even to express, hey, I'm really proud I was able to accomplish this thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But excessive pride, I suppose
Mm-hmm.
that would not be helpful.
And everyone is their own worst critic. We
Yeah, that's true.
see, we tend to see the absolute worst in ourselves. And I think maybe it stems from just a natural desire to want to do better. And I think it's important to try to want to be better. But I think one way to kind of retrain your brain a little bit could be to, every time you have a negative thought about yourself, first of all, recognize that, hey, I'm thinking negatively about myself, and then replace it with a compliment to yourself, kind of, well, like they used to say in school, if you put someone down, you got to give them two compliments.
No, I think have you done some cognitive behavioral work? Because I mean,
No.
this is exactly what I would say to someone. I described the change process, and I won't go into more detail because you've kind of hit on it. That if you have that negative thought or say something negative, the best way to change that is to out loud, I think, say, "Oh, I just said this negative thing, but what I really want to say is," and you replace it with that either positive thought, positive statement. The more you do that, then those negative thoughts, those negative comments, that negative self-talk is often how people describe it. That will decrease. And actually, you bring up a really good point, talking about those negative self comments, because that low self-esteem, people who have low self-esteem, I would guess more often than not, have a lot of negative self-talk. And so that's certainly one of the things that you want to work to change. And you describe exactly how you'd want to change that. It's just over time, you figure out how to replace them with positive thoughts. Have you ever seen someone who has an elastic band around their waist? It's an old cognitive behavioral trick and I think it's just to pair the flipping of the band. So every time you have that negative thought, say something you want to change, you flip the band and then say a positive thought. And there's some sort of matching that happens between the flipping the band, and it becomes this way to remind yourself, okay, I'm not going to do that. It's a little bit aversive. It's not so much that you're poking yourself, say with a pin, but you're just flipping yourself. And so often when you see people with rubber bands around their wrists, that's probably what they're doing.
Yeah. I did remember something. So I did therapy a number of years ago when I was diagnosed with postpartum depression. I did do talk therapy for a little while to help with that. And one of the things that the therapist said is they wanted me to think of, I don't remember the number, but a certain number of positive things about myself every day. And I think that's a great tip. And that sounds a little bit more like the 6 pillars of self-esteem, and it doesn't even have to be some extensive thing or some big thing. Just, maybe first thing in the day, think of 5 positive things that you like about yourself, something that you can focus on and maybe even build on.
So 5 is a good number. John Gottman, who I think I've mentioned before, and he's mostly known as a marriage or relationship researcher. But what he found in marriages anyway, is that 5 positive comments equal 1 negative. And so what that says is the negative has so much more power. And so if you really want to change, and he found that the 5 positive to 1 negative is what he would call a neutral situation. And so if you want to shift it slowly, you want to go 6, 7, the negative comments are really powerful. And so it's the same as parents. We probably got some parents that are listening.
Yeah.
The negative comments to your children are incredibly powerful, and they stick. The kids will remember them more easily than they will the positive. And so you got to give more positive reinforcement, more positive comments. And I think that our brains are very much geared toward looking at the negative. I mean, in some way, it's an honest thing that we're all, I think evolution has led us to be this way because it's how we survive. But if we really focus, you could, I think with most children, well, I was going to say all kids, I think you can find positive things about them. You may have to just think about it a little bit more. But the more we think about the positives, that changes the way we interact with them. And this ties into this subject because the more we do that, the better their self-esteem is going to be, because they will learn that, internal barometer of how the others see them. I mean, first and foremost, it's how the parents see them. That's how we grow up. And so if we feel that positive regard from our parents, then it's much easier to accept those compliments and to feel good about ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And this has been a fantastic conversation today. I will have any references posted in our show notes. I know that we didn't get to addiction today, like I said we would last week. However, we felt like this was an important topic to cover. And I think this is a really good dialogue, very relatable and very helpful for people.
I agree.
If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction and you really were looking forward to that episode or you need some advice on that, please feel free to email me, reach out. Our email will be listed in the podcast notes and we will be happy to discuss it. And you can be completely anonymous. I am happy to leave out names. So yeah, thanks everyone. And tune in next week because we are going to be talking about healthy relationships. So stay tuned for more on that. Thanks everyone. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.